Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our friends on the West Coast. Welcome to what is the second webinar of a three-part hiring series. Today's presentation is on turning inexperienced managers into master interviewers. It's brought to you today by Outmatch, leaders in transforming the world of work. My name is Charles Summers. It is my pleasure to be serving as your moderator during this hour. If you want to get in touch with me about future webinar topics, Outmatch-specific information, or if you would like to speak with one of our experts, reach out by email at csummers@outmatch.com or just chat in your comments. I just want to start by saying this is an especially exciting topic for us here at Outmatch, being at the forefront of talent strategy. We recently launched the Outmatch platform, a new website, and acquired Pomelo, which complements our predictive selection and development tools by helping companies measure and manage their organizational culture and increase employee engagement. As Outmatch's capabilities continue to grow, we'd like you to grow with us. So when you have a chance, head over to the website and check out all the new resources, sign up for a future webinar, and get the full scoop on the Outmatch platform by scheduling a tour at outmatch.com/schedule-a-demo. As a thank you for joining us today, all attendees will receive a free copy of our latest white paper, The Business Case for Hourly Assessments, 3 Risks Associated with Just Hiring. We know that the talent war, or the war for talent, is extremely competitive right now, and that's why it's important to give hiring managers the tools they need to be successful. This piece will help build your business case for providing such tools in your selection process. Just look for an email from me after the webinar. It's going to have this piece in there along with the slides. So if you'd like a recording of today's presentation, you can just email me at csummers@outmatch.com or go to outmatch.com/webinars to find all of our on-demand webinars. At this time, please take a moment to follow Outmatch on Twitter at OutmatchHCM and tweet questions, thoughts, or quotes as you're listening by using the hashtag OutmatchInsights. You can also interact with us using the questions queue in your GoToWebinar status window. Please feel free to ask questions, make comments, or share feedback at any point during the webcast. Again, you can also tweet your questions or comments to @OutmatchHCM with the hashtag OutmatchInsights. The feature presentation will take approximately 45 minutes, and following that, we will have some time set aside for a Q&A session with our presenter. So at this time, I'd like to introduce you to Tim Thomas, our presenter for today. Tim is a value advocate who works with large enterprise partners and small groups alike. With a focus on nurturing and maintaining partnerships, Tim uses his unique point of view across industries to bring best practice solutions to his clients. He provides strategic guidance and support to ensure that clients are seeing results and getting the most out of their partnership with us. All right, at this time, I'm just going to hand it over to Tim. So Tim, take it away.
Thank you, Charles. I appreciate the generous introduction. Good afternoon and good morning to everybody on the call. As part of our Hiring Success series today, we are going to be talking about an integral part of the talent selection process that happens in an organization. Interviews and what a hiring manager's perspective towards it looks like. This is obviously a very interesting topic to talk about for us, and hopefully it is for you as well. Typically, in most organizations, it is almost assumed that being able to approach an interview in the most objective way is a skill that you automatically acquire as a hiring manager, especially if you are someone who has had some level of success at putting teams together. Sometimes there is a perception that a hiring manager is the best person to make the determination on moving forward with a candidate because it's assumed that they know exactly what type of individual they need in their team. While this is partly true if you look at it from a skill perspective, but not necessarily true from a behavioral fit or culture fit perspective. So if you look at it from a different angle, right? Yes, the hiring manager knows exactly what type of candidate they want, but do they have the right skill, or are they being set up for success to be able to determine that when they have a conversation with a candidate in an interview, they're able to measure those things. So today we will talk a little bit about some general organizational level impact statistics and how they essentially trickle down to hiring decisions that are made. There are many critical parts to the selection process, and I know you're all well aware of that. Today, what we'll do is very quickly isolate a few interview common practices that are followed that might have a negative impact on your overall objectives as an organization. And once we go over that, I'll come back around and spend a little time discussing some best practices that hiring managers can follow, ultimately here to make a bigger, better, and positive impact that really helps with higher retention, reduced turnover, and higher performance. The good news is that these best practices that I'll be covering are things that your organization can very easily plug in to your current process, if you have one, or even get to start thinking about creating a robust and streamlined process in place. So what I'd like to start off today with our conversation is by taking a quick poll to really set up today's conversation. I'd like to understand what kind of level of interview process your organization currently has. You might have already have a pretty set process in place, or maybe your organization is a little more decentralized, and each region has sort of their own process. Or maybe you don't have a process in place at all. So go ahead and choose the appropriate choice that reflects where your organization is currently at, and I'll turn it over to Charles to conduct the poll.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just launch this poll real quick so everybody will have about a minute to get their answers in, and then we'll present the results here in about 45 seconds or so from now. And it looks like some answers are starting to roll in. We've got about 65% of you have put your votes in. About 39% are yeses, 54% are somewhat, and about 9% are no's. We'll give it another about 15 seconds here, and then we'll close the poll up. Okay, it looks like most of you have already put your votes in, so we're going to go ahead and share it with you all. So about 75% of you voted, so thank you for your responses. So I'll let Tim kind of talk to the results here, but it looks like the majority are in the somewhat range or yes range. So.
Yeah, thank you, Charles, and thank you, everyone, for your input. So it looks like we have a good variety, with most of you indicating that you have some sort of process in place, and that makes sense. So this conversation that we're going to have will be a good value add as you take this forward and measure it against what you are currently doing and see what else you can do to make sure your hiring managers are really set up for success while they interview candidates. Some of the things we talk about should be able to help you take up what you currently have up to another notch. So when we talk about hiring, one of the big things to keep in mind is cost per hire. Now, without getting into the nitty-gritty of what it relates to with respect to looking at ROI, I wanted to highlight this as a general measure of what type of dollars it really takes to get a hire. So the number you see, $4,129, was taken from the SHRM Human Capital Benchmarking Report. So if we know this is the cost to hire one candidate, and let's say you average about 500 hires a year, you multiply that, you're looking at close to $500,000. So it is crucial to make the right hire. So when turnover happens, if you look at cost of replacing an employee, those numbers really start adding up. Now, regardless of how those numbers add up for your organization, the key takeaway is that not hiring the right employee can have some serious adverse effects on your bottom line. Now, if you look at it from a process perspective and flow of information from a recruiter or HR to a hiring manager right before a candidate is interviewed, there's a good chance that the hiring manager is not being set up for success. In a recent study that was conducted by Ladders.com, it was found that recruiters take an average of 6 seconds to scan a resume. Now, especially for high volume roles, This would absolutely make sense. However, when you're pushing towards filling high turnover type of roles, who is really taking the ownership of making sure all the information you gathered about the candidate on the front end of the process is fully being translated over to the hiring manager in a way that they are really well equipped to ask the right questions? Is technology that you have being properly utilized? Are you making use of any predictive solutions? So there's quite a few ways you can really think about this. Now, briefly looking at interviews from a candidate perspective, it's interesting to see how interviews are viewed. In a recent study of candidates who were asked what made the most impact on your impression of a job, 47% it was the interview. And I don't think that's a surprise for anyone that's listening today. So how a hiring manager's interaction with the candidate and overall impression of the interview is critical in how you convey your organization's brand. So really starting from the ground up, let's talk about how important interviews are. And this might be just reiterating the information that, or the knowledge you already have about interviews. So interviews, certainly, they're a key part of the hiring process as they serve as a confirmation for whether or not a candidate is likely to succeed in the organization and the job. However, interviews are only as effective as how and when they're conducted. So if you really think about it, right? Today, what we're going to do is cover how some interview practices might not be capturing the right information about a candidate. So when the interview comes at the right place in the hiring process and it's conducted consistently across an organization, it can provide you with the confidence to move forward in that selection decision. Although job interviews are a time-consuming exercise for the hiring manager, they really bring a tremendous value to your selection process. In situations where companies receive a high volume of applicants for job openings, interviews really are a valuable tool for narrowing the field down. Now, if done effectively, the interview enables you as an employer to determine if an applicant's skills, experience, and personality meets the job's requirements. It also helps you as an employer assess whether an applicant would likely fit in with the corporate culture. So let's talk about the role that the hiring manager plays in the interview process. So I saw this quote, and I thought it was very impactful. This is what the quote says: "Your success as a manager is simply the result of how good you are at hiring the people around you." If you think about it, that makes complete sense. Several years ago, the Corporate Leadership Council surveyed approximately 8,000 recruiters to determine what's the most critical to effective recruiting. The most common answer was the hiring manager, not a surprise there. In another recent study that they conducted, the council analyzed 30 factors to determine what's most important when it comes to attracting and retaining employees. So it found that base pay was one of those factors, which we know it's pretty common understanding. And the next one was the quality of the manager. So these were by far the two biggest ways that study said from the feedback they got on ways to attract and retain talent. So without question, we know hiring managers are key to hiring success. Yet ironically, one of the biggest challenges recruiters face is flow of information to and from a hiring manager. Because of how critical and important the hiring manager plays a role in the recruitment process, it's absolutely vital that they're aligned correctly as far as how they're approaching the interview process. You can ask any question you want and still not figure out correctly if the candidate you're interviewing is the right fit or not. And a lot of times information gathered during the interview can be subjective, and this certainly skews objectivity. So what we'll do is we'll highlight some common practices that hiring managers follow that are not effective. And like I mentioned before, we'll also come back and cover what some best practices to follow are. So we discussed how important interviews are in the talent selection process. I think we can all agree on that. We also talked a little bit about how critical the role of the hiring manager is. Let's talk a little bit about how some of the ineffective ways that interviews are carried out can really impact your organization's bottom line. There are quite a few that we can cover. However, for the purposes of this webinar, I've identified a few key interview practices that are really common to organizations. And by going over these, I'm hoping it'll help you thinking about your own organization and help you identify areas that might need to change, or maybe even affirm what you're doing correctly. So there are four main areas that I would like to talk about, starting with asking the wrong questions. In my experience over the past 10 years of putting teams together, I've noticed I certainly fall into this trap of not asking the right questions, or maybe even trying to cover too much ground in one interview. You have anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour to get to know the candidate and see if they're a right fit. Going into the interview, you might have an idea of what questions you want to ask. There might be even a specific type of formula or a way that works best for you. However, that plan can certainly take a turn based on how the candidate responds in an interview, right? You can find yourself trying to understand what the candidates really be bogged down by trying to understand what the candidate's previous job experience was. Or if you have multiple interviewers, you can find a conversation going down multiple rabbit trails, and you're really struggling to bring it back. You can have candidates who give you short answers, long responses, some who answer to the point, and more than frequently you see ones that go around in circles. The point is, you have the short amount of time to know everything about the candidate, and not asking the right questions could be the difference in making the wrong decision or making the right one. Some examples of questions, right? Why do you want to work here? Or what did you like or dislike about your last job? Or even what are your strengths and weaknesses? These are questions that really don't give a lot of depth of knowledge into the candidate. You might ask, what's wrong with these questions, right? Well, fundamentally nothing if the objective is to weed out the unprepared, the lazy, or the mediocre. These are certainly questions that can have cookie-cutter answers for. In fact, a simple Google search could give you exactly the right way to answer these questions. The next point I wanted to bring up is preparation, or really lack thereof. Going blind into an interview that is only gathering information from a resume is something that is pretty common. Failing to prepare adequately for an interview sets you up with a very high likelihood to not understand whether the person you're interviewing is a good fit or not, especially when you're interviewing a high volume of candidates. According to Dr. John Sullivan from ERE Media, this is what he says, and I'll read his exact quote. By design, all resumes are written from a totally biased perspective because they are written with the goal of making the owner look as good as possible. I chuckled when I read that because I think everyone has written resumes, and you certainly write it with that perspective, right? We also use resumes as a primary selection mechanism, despite the fact that by design, they really omit all negatives. It's 100% positive by design because all negatives and shortcomings have been purposely taken out. No one in their right mind includes errors and negatives in their resumes. And here's a really astonishing fact. I think a lot of folks know this in the back of their minds, but resumes contain a lot of misrepresentations. In fact, this same study that Dr. John Sullivan did said that as many as 78% of resumes are misleading and 53% contain outright lies. So if the writer of the resume is not skilled at populating their resume with the right keywords, their resume may never be seen by a recruiter or hiring manager. And because I'm alluding to the earlier stat that I showed, corporate recruiters average 6 seconds reading a resume, the scannability of a resume becomes more important than its content. According to a study conducted by the Harvard Business Review, While unstructured interviews consistently receive the highest ratings for perceived effectiveness from hiring managers, dozens of studies have found them to be among the worst predictors of actual on-the-job performance. They're far less reliable than general mental ability tests, aptitude tests, or personality tests. Let's talk about job requirements and how they can allude to ineffective interview practices. So really not knowing what you're looking for, right? Being unaware of job-specific requirements, thus you end up evaluating the candidate on wrong factors. This can happen with organizations who don't have a specific or standard talent selection process. It becomes highly dependent on the hiring manager to convey to their recruiting team on what type of skills, qualities they need in the ideal candidate that they're looking for. If this is not communicated correctly, which happens quite a bit, then there's an absolute breakdown in the type of candidate you're bringing in. So the selection criteria used by recruiters and hiring managers are typically not done in a scientific way. They're typically just made up on the fly and inaccurate. So without really understanding what type of skills or measures of success is needed to be highly successful at a particular job, how do you know what to look for in a candidate? If it seems your business consistently chooses the wrong applicant, it might be because you're basing the hiring decisions mainly on job-specific qualifications. While credentials, formal education, and job-related experience are important, they may not be enough to help you choose the perfect candidate. Selection criteria include, but go further than job-related qualifications. They really force you to consider non-job specific skills, general knowledge, personal attributes, and traits vital to successful performance and long-term employment. A recent survey by Robert Half, they surveyed 1,400 executives, and a third of those executives felt that the top factor leading to a failed hire, aside from performance issues, is a poor skills match. And the second most common reason was unclear performance objectives. Gamble, who runs the Chicago-based Gene Gamble and Associates, believes that wrong hiring occurs because hiring manager and human resource folks confuse the job description with the job criteria. And I thought this was a really important point to bring up. The job definition and the criteria for the job are different. And often, if you went to people who actually perform the job, you could possibly hear an entirely different description of what it takes to perform the necessary tasks than what's posted in the job description or in the job definition. The last point I wanted to talk about as far as ineffective interview practices is relying just on the interview. According to the author of The Best Place to Work, who's Ron Friedman, he says 81% of people lie in their interviews, and we covered that with regard to resumes. If you think about it, that's a pretty alarming rate, right? Interviews can very well be used as one of the main, if not the only tools for selecting a candidate. At a previous job where I had the responsibility to put together a team of 40 people within a matter of months, I really experienced this to the fullest. Because of the extreme need to fill seats and bring people in right away, we relied heavily on the interview, and that was the main tool in determining whether to hire a candidate or not. We had about and maybe some of you can relate to this, especially for high volume roles. We had 10 to 15 30-minute interviews lined up every day, and our management team would go in as a team of two and interview each of these candidates. In hindsight, looking back at this process, it probably caused more difficulty in getting the right candidate in place because we weren't hiring the best fit, and that caused issues with performance, productivity, and overall turnover. We were, in fact, spending more time trying to hire folks that would leave right after training than anything else. Unfortunately, many organizations are in the same space. They tend to depend heavily on the actual interview and get stuck in this relentless cycle of hiring talent And then replacing lost talent due to high turnover. So we covered a few ineffective interview practices, and hopefully that got you thinking a little bit about your organization and where you are currently. So let's quickly discuss a few effective interview practices. Once again, the goal is that this will equip you and give you some really good ideas to take back and implement within your own organization, or maybe even help affirm that you're doing things the right and effective way. So preparation. We talked about preparation or lack thereof as an effective way to approach an interview. Well, let's look at the other side of it, right? We discussed the impact hiring managers can have by making the wrong decision on a candidate. That's why it's highly effective to be prepared before going into an interview. Just looking at a resume and scanning through it is obviously not very effective. However, leveraging technology through the tools that you currently have is very important. If you have an assessment tool baked into the application process, it will be highly effective to use the information you have gathered about the candidate into that preparation. Framing your questions to uncover things you have not been able to discover from a resume or assessment or any other earlier steps is really a good way to go. Also, when you have a set amount of time for an interview, whether it's 30 minutes or an hour, you might not be able to ask all the questions you want. So being able to gather the most relevant and important information from a candidate during a short time requires you to be prepared and know what questions you're going to ask beforehand. It's always, I understand this, it's always difficult to carve out the necessary preparation time, but doing so can have a significant impact on the final outcome of the interview process. Preparing for an interview is an important first step in the process. To do this, you need to also make sure that you're familiar with the available position and the qualification the job requires. And we'll talk about that a little bit more a little later. So these steps can really help ensure you're selecting the right person for the job you're interviewing for. We alluded to soft skills a little bit. With regard to soft skills, or soft skills assessment, on a poll conducted by LinkedIn, 9,000 recruiters and hiring managers were asked this question. So the question they were asked was, what factors into why traditional interviews fail? It was asked from a different perspective, but the response really stood out to our current conversation. So the question again was, what factors into why traditional interviews fail? So 63% said it was failing to assess a candidate's soft skills. Some of the feedback that was received through that poll about the benefits of soft skills assessment was that it was more realistic snapshot of a candidate's personality, and also it creates a positive candidate experience. So what that says is that while having a basic technical skill on doing a job is a must, that is not the only thing you can measure, or maybe that's not an effective way to see if a candidate, that's not the only effective way to see if a candidate is the right fit. Looking at soft skills, personality, culture fit are all important aspects that need to be considered. So this all really ties back into how much of an impact it makes when hiring the wrong person, or for that matter, how much of an impact it makes when hiring the right person. Being objective in an interview is certainly something that a lot of hiring managers struggle to do, and we can certainly dive into this particular point a lot, but I want to make sure to be efficient in the way we cover this topic. So it's important to avoid common interview biases, such as inconsistency in questioning, or even first impressions, maybe negative emphasis, or maybe it's nonverbal bias. Or whether it's halo or horn effect, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Not being consistent in the way you ask questions across candidates for the same job really skews your assessment on the candidate if they'd be able to perform the job the best. Biases such as first impressions can cloud an entire interview based on making a snap judgment, whether it's positive or negative. Research indicates that interviewers give unfavorable information about twice the weight of favorable information. So it's important not to reject a candidate based on small amounts of negative information. which, believe it or not, happens quite a bit. I refer to the halo or the horn effect. The halo effect occurs when an interviewer allows one strong point about the candidate to overshadow or have an effect on everything else. For instance, knowing if someone went to, say, a particular university might be looked upon favorably. So everything the applicant says during the interview is seen in this light. Something like, well, she left out an important part of the answer to that question, but she must know it. She went to this XYZ university. And the horn effect is just the opposite, allowing one weak point to influence everything else. Undue emphasis might be placed on nonverbal cues that have nothing to do with the job, such as loudness or softness of someone's voice, or the type of handshake given. A very common bias that happens is the contrast effect. So basically what that is stronger candidates who interview after weaker ones may appear more qualified than they are because of the contrast between the two. So these are some of the common things that interviewers mostly unknowingly fall into, and that it can skew their perspective about a candidate. Being aware of these biases that can affect judgment before going into an interview is very key. This really falls a lot into how well you prepare for an interview, and we talked about that a little earlier, and using the interview just as one of the tools along with all the other resources that you have into the hiring decision. Behavioral-based approach, this might sound familiar to you, and let's talk about that a little bit. Behavioral interviewing is based on the premise that how a candidate behaved in a past job is the best predictor of how they'll behave in the future. Because your time with each candidate is limited, you want to find out the most relevant information about their past experience. So it's important to strategically choose your behavioral interview questions. To focus your behavioral-based questions, think about them in relation to the job, right? Now that's easier said than done. So to elicit such information, a behavioral interviewer first, you got to identify the skills or competencies necessary for a particular position. For example, whether it's decision-making or persuasion skills or problem-solving ability. And then once you've identified those specific skills or competencies, then use a series of probing questions to reveal whether the candidates actually possess those qualities. Look at the job description. Determine key competencies required to successfully perform the role that you're looking to hire in. What knowledge, skills, abilities does the position require? Pick out 3 to 5 areas of focus rather than simply asking transparent interview questions about what the candidates did in their jobs. Behavioral interviews ask candidates how and why they did it. So this approach is extremely effective at identifying unqualified applicants or those who tend to even exaggerate in interviews and on their resumes. The result is that the most important component and the most competent and best qualified candidates are hired. So whenever possible, create a checklist, a scoring system for each question or area of focus. Objective measures will certainly help you reduce any unconscious interview bias that we kind of refer to when it comes to making a hiring decision. Your interview process is part of your employer brand, right? So getting organized about how you conduct interviews will not only show candidates that you respect their time, it'll make your hiring decisions easier. Behavioral interviews definitely require some planning ahead, but the payoff is high. So the last point here I wanted to talk about is technology. We alluded to leveraging technology a little earlier. It's really making sure you're effectively using the tools that are available to you. Let's just say if you have a personality assessment tool, then make sure that candidates are using that as part of their application process. As an HR or recruiting team, it's important to make sure that the information you gathered from the assessment for a candidate is really passed on into the next step or trickle down into the next step in the talent selection process, aka the interviewer. At the beginning of this webinar, we had asked a question about if your organization had a set interview process. So it's important to make that process standard across your organization. And technology can certainly help make that easier. Outmatch assessments is a good example of that, and I can give you a quick preview of how Outmatch really leverages the information gathered from a candidate to help the hiring manager succeed in assessing the candidate during an interview. When you have such a short amount of time to talk to a candidate, you have to be very targeted in the way you ask your questions. We covered a lot of things. Things that are ineffective as far as interview practices, and also very effective or best practices that can be followed. Now, if you're a hiring manager, you know very well that interviewing candidates are just one of the things you need to do in an already busy day, in addition to managing your team and getting your normal routine of work going. The idea of being prepared and leveraging information that you already know about the candidate through their resume or through personality and behavior assessments, and targeting the interview to be very specific and making that process standard, it's all well and great. But there's a lot of work that goes behind it. Wouldn't it be great for hiring managers to have a standard format to follow and have a lot of the clutter and the complexity really taken out of their day? Also, wouldn't it be great to have targeted questions focusing on areas of weaknesses identified through a personality assessment that's already put in place, so that all the hiring manager needs to do is focus in on those areas and really focus their time and energy preparing to ask those questions rather than scrambling to look through the resume and come up with questions on their own? Well, the assessment tool by Outmatch has really taken the complexity out of the process. We have really focused our assessment tool to be something that you can comprehensively use throughout the talent selection process. I'd like to show you a quick preview of what that looks like and how it'll really help set up a hiring manager for success while interviewing a candidate. What you're able to do is capture information about the candidate on the front end of the process, right? So once you do that, you're able to transfer that information throughout the process, and you're able to progressively build upon what you already know about the candidate. Looking at Outmatch assessments, the candidate report that you have available once an assessment is complete, it gives you the ability to really streamline your hiring process and make the flow of candidate information seamless. Here's the type of information that you'll see in the candidate report. So there's really four main areas that I want to highlight. So the overview tab gives you a snapshot of the score and a high-level information on how the candidate has scored. The next tab, which is the Key Insights tab, goes into more detail on what factors and traits contributed to that overall score. The next tab, which is the Interview module, captures the data from the assessment and puts them into a configured interview-ready format. The Development module takes it a step further and provides a good set of strengths and opportunities that can be used as part of onboarding a new hire. You'll notice that each of these modules really help with the smooth flow of information that is being captured along the talent selection process. You also have the Share option, which is where we're really leveraging technology to be able to easily share this information between recruiting or HR teams and hiring managers. Now, what I'd like to do is really dive in a little bit more deeper and kind of show you what our reports look like. I mainly want to focus in on the Overview tab and the Interview tab, since that's relevant to our conversation, without really going into much of the details. As I mentioned earlier, the Overview tab provides a snapshot of the candidate's performance on the assessment. This snapshot provides you just a glance indication of the candidate's objective potential. The score range of a half check to 5 checks will fall within the 4 recommendation ranges, which is poor match, fair match, good match, or strong match. And you see that on the top right, and you'll also see that if you have any cognitive ability scores that are being measured, you'll see that along with its relevance and overall score. In addition to the scores, the overview contains a few additional pieces of useful information. The report also provides insight into where the candidate stands relative to your applicant pool within the last 60 days. So once more, this helps you prioritize your resources and allows you to focus on your best candidates first. The last part of the overview is a summary of the candidate's leading strengths and potential weaknesses. And the good news here is you can click on each trait to read its definition, so really no interpretation necessary from your end. Next, let's jump on to the interview module. So this is really what I wanted to show you. As we already know, since the interview is one of the most critical parts of the hiring process, and we've talked about that in many different ways, the Outmatch report, the candidate report, is designed to help keep it simple and objective. This section of the report will help to ensure that the interview is job relevant, consistent, and structured. So all the questions provided here align specifically to the job that you're hiring for. The opening questions are provided to really set the stage for the interview, and this is where you can even configure it that's specific to your organization. Next is there are competency questions that are based on each hiring profile or the benchmark for each profile, and that'll help you dig into a candidate's job match potential, and this is also something that's configurable if you have access to this. The last portion is really that's really exciting for me to share is really the dynamic follow-up questions. They're individually generated based on the candidate's assessment results. These questions, they're designed to help you gain insight into the candidate's strengths and potential limitations into the role. What's unique about this is not only is there a question generated based on how they scored in the assessment, there's also a listen for portion that really takes the complexity out of the process for the interviewer, so they know what question to ask, really carrying forward the information from the personality assessment about the candidate, and then they know what to listen for, so they're able to really capture more information about the candidate. So whether you're an experienced interviewer or an inexperienced interviewer, you'll be able to leverage this section of the report to get the most out of the interview process. All right. I know we covered quite a bit of ground in a short amount of time. I wanted to be able to wrap everything up by just going over a few commonly asked questions that we've heard from our clients. So one of the first questions is, how does using an interview guide help with setting an overall standard process for hiring managers? So we talk a lot about setting a set process and putting a set process in place, right? Having a tool such as an interview guide that all hiring managers use will really help make that process uniform and contribute to an effective approach in analyzing and interviewing candidates. Let's look at the next question. What are some effective ways to start implementing a common set of practices for hiring managers? We talked a little bit about ineffective interview practices earlier. If you're able to identify those type of practices for your organization, then working to remove those and replace it with some best practices we talked about is a good start. My suggestion is to really start small and build on it. Going to the next question, is it common practice for companies to have trainings for their recruiters and hiring managers? In fact, you know what? We're seeing this more more and more with a lot of our clients, especially as they're using the assessment tool and as they look to deriving full value out of the tool they have. The interview guide is something that they're able to really leverage, and then really equipping recruiters and managers to be able to use that tool. So certainly the answer is yes. We're seeing that more and more often. Next question here is, for a highly decentralized organization, is this really practical? The answer is absolutely. And some of the challenges that you'll have with a decentralized organization is really to get a standard process in place, right? So a tool like Outmatch Assessment or having a standard interview guide is something that you can have all your hiring manager and HR and recruiting team use without really having to spend a lot of time putting in a standard process in place. That really leveraging that type of tool will help standardize a lot of things in that talent selection process. I have one last question here before we wrap things up. Can you configure the Outmatch interview guide to make questions organization specific? Absolutely, and that's something that we pride ourselves on. The interview guide has the three sections I talked about. The first two sections, which is the opening section, and then the second section, which is the competency-based questions. Those can absolutely be configured based on your organization's needs. And the last portion is really derived from how the candidate has scored and just based on their strengths and weaknesses. So that really wraps things up. I'll turn it over to Charles to see if we can maybe answer some questions that anyone might have.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So that was awesome. Appreciate your presentation and you taking the time to speak with everybody today. So this brings us to the question portion of our webinar today. So, I'm going to go over one thing quick here, but while I'm going through it, think of some questions that you might have, and then, send them in, and then we'll answer them for you here on the air. So before we dive into the Q&A portion of this webinar, we just want to answer a question we received via LinkedIn. And so anytime really before we have a webinar, go ahead and send us your questions on LinkedIn. We'll make sure that we answer them live during our webinar. But anyway, so Mario asked, what are your top 3 recommended questions that address culture alignment? So Tim, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and thank you, Mario, for posting that question. With culture being such an important factor in measuring if a candidate is a right fit or not, it's important to make sure culture-related questions are brought up in an interview. First thing to focus on is to make sure the questions are not asked in a leading way, but they're more open-ended, more behavioral type questions specific to culture. I think what this does is it really helps focus in on what the candidate's preference is, thus enabling you as a hiring manager to gauge if they're a good fit for your company's culture. Also, it's important to ask these culture questions that focus in on specific culture value, right? For example, let's say if customer orientation is a value that you're trying to cultivate kind of as part of your overall building of culture, then you can ask something like, tell me about a time when you listened to a customer and that really changed your response or behavior. What you can do is really listen for what prompted this response or behavior and really how they went about it. What you can really look at is if this is something that comes naturally or intuitively to them to be able to listen and respond to customers based on their needs. It really helps you gauge what the candidate's natural tendencies are. So that's how I would recommend phrasing those type of questions.
Great. We'll move on to the next phase here. Thank you, Tim. Okay, so we did get a few questions that rolled in, and we've got some really good ones. So the first one here comes from Valerie, and I know, Tim, you have some experience working with clients on this sort of thing, but her question is, what is best practice for assessments in the interview process? For example, after a candidate applies for a job, before phone screening, after telephone screening, things like that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. In fact, that's a question we get asked a lot by our clients. So it's really organization specific, right? So the way we recommend is really put that assessment in the front end of the process, right? So you want to be able to have all your candidates that go through and apply, and that way you're not missing anybody as far as really gauging their fit. The recommendation here is really put the assessment at the front end of the process, and that's really the most effective way to do it. But it always varies depending on what your application process looks like. But I would say front end of the process works typically.
Great. We've got a couple of questions from Adriana in here. Adriana, I'm actually going to follow up with you directly on those questions that you had. We have one here on ROI, and so just providing, ROI in implementing a process. So I'm assuming the question here from actually a person named Tim, so coincidentally. Yeah, so the question is basically how do you find ROI in implementing a new process? So maybe speak to our technology a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we do is, as we have clients come in, our main goal is to show value for them, right? So we're able to collect information based on their candidates that go through and those candidates that are hired, and then we're able to capture that information over a period of time and really able to showcase what type of difference assessments have really made for them, and really showcasing to them that using technology through Outmatch assessments and how much that has made a difference on their turnover or and just really their ROI numbers.
Okay, perfect. A couple of questions that came in just about integrating their current systems that they have in place, like applicant tracking systems and things like that. I see a couple of people actually listed their applicant tracking system as UltiPro, and just integrating that, that piece into the puzzle.
Yep.
Maybe just walk us through kind of how that works a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely, and really excited about that because through Outmatch assessments, we've made that process really easy. UltiPro is one of the partners that we do work with, and you'll find that once you have the assessment set up, it's really a drop down and choose the ATS that you have. And it's a really straightforward process. That's something that I've noticed a lot of companies struggle with as far as setting up that integration. What we've done internally is focused on making that process easy for our clients, whether it's using the assessment, being able to integrate to your ATS, and specifically UltiPro is a partner that we work closely, and you'll find that we are able to really integrate you in a click and drop down and click type of process, so it's very easy.
Right. Our last question here actually comes in from I think it's Elisa or Eliza, and she's just asking to get a copy of the presentation, and I had a couple of other questions like that. And yes, so you will receive an email directly from me here after the webinar, probably within the next couple of hours. And you'll have the slide deck available in there as well as the free piece of content on hourly assessments that I had promised at the beginning. The actual recording will be available within 48 hours, and then that you can find that on our webinars page on our website, and also on YouTube. All of our on-demand webinars and our podcast live there, so you can go on there and take a look at that. And then just lastly, going back to the question on ROI, we do have some calculators that you can use, so please reach out to me directly at csummers@outmatch.com, and I can help you get in touch with somebody that can help you kind of calculate the ROI ahead of time before you implement any kind of process. But that brings us to the end of our questions, our Q&A session. So I just want to go ahead and thank you all for attending part 2 of our hiring series. If you enjoyed it and you'd like more best practices on talent selections, then come back for part 3. We're going to talk about how to reinforce your culture with a strong onboarding process. And then you can get those previous webinars on demand too, the part 1 and part 2. So since our hiring, since it's a 3-part series, you've already registered for part 3, so you should already have an invitation on your calendar. If you need anything, again, you can email me at csummers@outmatch.com or go to Outmatch webinar or outmatch.com/webinars to find all of our on-demand webinars. Hope to see everybody again next month to learn about what best-in-class companies are doing to engage new hires before day 1 and what they do during the onboarding process to drive productivity and performance. So once again, I just want to thank you all for coming on the call today, and we will see you next month.